Alright guys, in this video we'll be going over my PvE Nightblade tank build. For this video we will be sticking to just the dungeon setup. If you guys want me to do the trial setup, I can also do that in a separate video. I also do have these builds published to esohub.com, which I will be leaving a link to that in the description as well. I would like to start this by saying that this is my build that I kind of have accumulated together from other builds that I've seen, and it's all personal preference, and there are flex spots within this build. This build is quite flexible. It's fundamentally good at tanking, but as far as what I run around that, kind of to support the group and whatnot, primary focus with this build is going to be debuffing adds for your team. As well as occasional throwing a buff out for your teammates. Now, I have tanked just about every vet dungeon there is in the game with this build. I'll admit that one of the main selling points to this build is its speed. It's around cap, and you will outrun most of your teammates during a dungeon. And with that being said, let's get this started. And what you're looking at now is my character sheet. Everything you see here is pre-buff. I have no food going. No ability buffs going. This is just my base stats. Now, what I would recommend and what I do with my build is when I have my Bewitched Sugar Skulls active, I do like to have roughly 20k magicka and stamina. And I would generally say that 40k health is good. You want at least 40k health on both your bars. You may notice I do only have 24k resistances. This build is designed to give you major and minor resolve at all times, and with those buffs active, you should be sitting right around cap, which is 33k resistances. You don't want to go over that because you will sacrifice block mitigation. And I do generally aim for 1000 stam and mag recovery and roughly 4000 health recovery. With 500 ultimate and Bewitched Sugar Skulls active. And with this build, you should have roughly 70% block mitigation. Believe it or not, while it can go a long way, you can get away with just about any race for this build. Obviously, Nord, Orc, or Imperial are the ideal races, but I prefer Khajiit just for the sustain. Argonian is also a viable option if you're looking to heal yourself for more. It really just comes down to preference, but my best recommendation would be Orc for that additional speed buff. Alright, for this next part, we're going to be going over what sets you'll be running for this build. We'll be going over how these sets fit into your rotation later on in the video, so stay tuned for that. Starting with the 2-piece Void Bash set that comes out of Vateshran Hollows. This set will act as an AoE pull, pulling in all adds within 12 meters of you. While perfected is always nice, it is not at all necessary. And of course, please be sure to take note of enchantments and traits on all these pieces. Neat thing about this set is it does apply AoE Major Maim, which is great for ad pools. Moving on to your back bar, you'll be running Crimson Oath, Weapons, and Jewelry. This set is extremely helpful for your DDs that are wearing either medium armor or are just not meeting the 7k pen cap. Another thing I love about this set is that it does fit into the rotation very nicely, as you will see later. And the added armor is definitely a plus. You'll also notice that the range on this set is the same as the Vateshran Hollows set, meaning it's not super important when you trigger each set at the beginning of the rotation. This set can be found in the Dungeon Dread Cellar. Of course, for your 2-piece monster set, you will want to be running Nazarays, which is from Veteran Shipwright's Regret. And I would recommend running the heavy Helm and Shoulders. And essentially what this set does is it extends the length of all your debuffs applied to adds within a certain radius of you, again with the 12-meter radius. And because of this set, you do want to make sure your ultimate is at 350 before you use it, for guaranteed uptime on all your debuffs. So please make sure all your debuffs are active before using your ultimate. It's also important to mention that Nazaray doesn't affect the debuff that Crimson Oath applies. However, that set automatically has 100% uptime. The last set for this build is of course Turning Tide, which can also be found in Shipwright's Regret. I chose to run this on body because I found it easier to proc with both bars. And while all the sets I mentioned so far are heavy sets, it's still very important that you wear these on the pieces that I have them on as far as back bar and body, because your back bar triggers your Crimson Oath and you do not want your front bar to trigger Crimson Oath. And it is still all around easier to not have to worry about what bar you're on to proc Turning Tide. This set does proc off of whatever bar you block on, and during some content it can be hard to keep track, so I definitely prefer body anyways. Turning Tide applies AoE major vulnerability to all enemies in front of you, and this is vital to the build because this will be your only source of major vulnerability. It's a very important major debuff that all tanks should be applying one way or another, which makes the enemies take 10% more damage. Don't worry, you'll be seeing all of this in action at the end of the video. Typically, you do want to run reinforced on your chest and legs because those are your biggest armor pieces. The smaller pieces, I do like to run sturdy, and I definitely recommend running all health glyphs on all your armor pieces. And I'll briefly show you that, pause if you need. Next we have jewelry. I definitely recommend infused for all 3 pieces. As for glyphs, I do run reduced cost to block on my amulet and try regen for my rings. I would just tweak the jewelry glyphs for whatever works for you. Now moving on to your skills. You will notice there's actually a build advisory for Nightblade tank, Living Shadow. While I do use a lot of the abilities, I didn't really base my build off of it at all. It goes without saying you definitely want to get all your class passives, especially from the Shadow tree, and definitely also your Racial and Undaunted passives. Starting with your front bar, we've got Sap Essence. This can be used anytime after you proc the Void Bash set and you have as many adds around you as possible at a maximum of 6. It'll be a heal over time. It's a morph of Drain Power, which is the last ability in the siphoning line. Next we have Silver Leash, which is a morph of Silver Bolts from the Fighters Guild line. This is a single target pull that can also be used as a long range taunt. Next we have Power Slam, which is a morph of Power Bash from the Sword and Board line. The sole purpose of using this ability is to proc your Void Bash set, again pulling all enemies within 12 meters of you. Do keep in mind that you do not want to block before casting this ability because it can proc Turning Tide. Next of course is Mirage, which is a morph of Blur, which can be found in the Assassination skill line. This is the only source of minor resolve for you, and you want to pop it as soon as you're done with the initial rotation. It also gives you major evasion, which is another very important buff. You definitely want this on your front bar and not on the same bar as Crimson Oath, as it could accidentally proc that set. Last but not least, we have Pierce Armor, which is a morph of Puncture, the first ability in the Sword and Board skill line. Not only will this act as your main taunt, but it also will apply 2 important debuffs. And you will of course want to keep that taunt active at all times, but this ability should not be a primary concern in an ad pool, unless of course you're dealing with one bigger ad that could possibly one-shot another teammate. The ultimate on your front bar will be Incapacitating Strikes, a morph of Deathstroke, which can be found in the Assassination line. I cannot stress this enough, you will almost never use this ultimate. It is simply there for the slotted passive of Reeve, which you can read about here. The only ultimate you should ever be using will be on your back bar. In a very rare circumstance where you don't have enough ultimate for aggressive Warhorn, but it will be a wipe if something doesn't die that second, you can use this. And that will be it for your front bar. Now moving on to the back bar, we start with Refreshing Path, which is a morph of Path of Darkness from the Shadow line. Not only will this be a handy AoE heal for you and your teammates, it'll also proc Major Resolve from the passive in the Shadow tree. We'll also see in a bit that I do use this ability as a speed buff in between ad pools. Then we move on to Lotus Fan, which is one of the more controversial class abilities I do use. A morph of Teleport Strike that can be found in the Assassination skill tree. This ability applies AoE minor vulnerability, which is still a very important debuff for a tank to apply. The major downside to this ability is that it cannot be block casted, like every other ability on the list. However, it does make a nice gap closer at the beginning of an ad pool. Next we have my favorite ability, and arguably the most important ability on this bar. Dark Cloak is a morph of Shadow Cloak, which can be found in the Shadow skill line. Not only is this an OP heal over time, It also acts as the ability that procs your Crimson Oath set. Gives you minor protection, which is another important buff. It has an exactly 12-second timer, which is exactly the length of the cooldown for Crimson Oath, meaning you don't want to reactivate the ability before the 12-second timer falls off. And just a reminder, you do get an extra 3% max health for every shadow ability slotted, as well as extending your major resolve. Concealed weapon is a flex spot, and I mostly run it for minor expedition. Then you have destructive clench, which acts as a long-range taunt, as well as a single target application of major maim. It's important that you do run an ice staff or this will not taunt. Another option for a long-range taunt is inner fire from the Undaunted skill line, but I found that frost clench was much more reliable. Last but certainly not least, we have Aggressive Horn, which is a morph of Warhorn found in the Assault line. This will be your primary ultimate used, and just a reminder, you do want to wait till it's at 350 to proc it. It will proc your Nazare, so make sure you have all of your debuffs applied before using it. Certainly no harm in hoarding your ultimate, as you'll see in the next segment, and the main reason you're running this is for minor force, so it is fine to use at least 10 seconds after another player. For the sake of time, I'm just going to flash the CP up on the screen, pause if needed. Alright, now time for the actual rotation. You'll notice I do throw down Refreshing Path in between just about every ad pool to give me and my team a speed buff. You'll almost always want the first ability in your rotation to be a taunt when starting a boss fight, immediately followed by Lotus Fan, which makes a nice gap closer, as well as applies minor vulnerability. Then you want to proc your Void Bash set with Power Slam, pulling in all ads within 12 meters. You'll want to begin block casting for the rest of the rotation. It's important not to do this any sooner, as to avoid accidentally proccing Turning Tide too early. At this point in the rotation, you'll want to go ahead and use your Dark Cloak to proc your Crimson Oath set, and try to keep an ear out for when your shield gets hit and you block an attack, so you can go ahead and bash and proc your Turning Tide. Depending on how long the fight lasts, once you have all your debuffs applied, you want to start applying all your buffs. Remember to keep 100% uptime on your Crimson Oath by hitting Dark Cloak every 12 seconds and not before. Remember all your sets do have visual cues, Turning Tides being pink smoke on top of the enemy's heads, and Crimson Oath being a black smoke that kind of bursts from around you in all directions. It is also very helpful to use Refreshing Path in ad pools and boss fights, not only for the heal over time for you and your teammates, it also gives you guys higher recoveries. Remember to, of course, use Pierce Armor at least every 15 seconds during a boss fight, and depending on how long your ad pools are lasting, use Pierce Armor individually on ads as well, beginning with the bigger ads and working your way down. And don't forget in both boss fights and ad pools to use your single target pull, Silver Leash, to pull in smaller ads. It can also be used as a long-range taunt if you're out of Magicka. As for your ultimate, I don't have a demonstration for you in this video, but essentially all you need to do is make sure you apply your major and minor vulnerability, as well as major and minor breach with Pierce Armor, and then hit your Warhorn. I would definitely recommend having it to where you can see all your buffs and debuffs on your screen, as you see here in my gameplay, and just make sure you see all the debuffs I just mentioned active before popping Warhorn. And with that, I believe I've covered every ability on your bar, as well as how to proc all of your sets. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope that you learned something. I hope that this build seems interesting to you. I find this build to be very fun and efficient and underrated. I've got to be honest, one of the main reasons why I'm making this video is to shed some light on just how OP a Nightblade tank can be, and in hopes that at least one person gives it a try and likes it. And of course, don't forget to check the description for that link to this build on esohubs.com. If you do decide to try out this build, also feel free to let me know in the comments how it worked for you. I do also have some other builds on ESO Hub you guys can check out. Let me know if you guys want to see videos on those builds too. Alright, I'll shut up. Let you enjoy the last few seconds of this dungeon in peace. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video. Possibly.